A photograph found in a Cincinnati Historical Society archive shows a woman with an unnaturally smooth face and a disturbing smile. The note with it, written in 1903, claims the image shows the wife who was perfected. What the camera captured that day would take many years to fully understand. The Cincinnati Historical Society keeps a large collection of 1800s photographs in climate-controlled storage under its main building. Most images show ordinary lives, family portraits and street scenes from a city going through changes. But in the spring of 1972, an archivist named Dorothy Brennan found something that didn't fit among the regular family portraits. The photograph had been filed in the wrong place, hidden behind images of wedding parties and anniversary celebrations. The woman in the picture sat stiffly in a wooden chair, her posture unnaturally straight. Her face looked smooth, almost without features in its balance. But her smile caught immediate attention. It looked wrong, too wide and too frozen, as though her mouth had been forced into an expression it could no longer leave. The photo paper had yellowed with age, but the image stayed disturbingly clear. A note came with the photograph, written in neat German-style handwriting on paper from that time period. Margareta Vogel, wife of Dr. Hinrich Vogel, Germania District, Cincinnati. The wife who was perfected. May God forgive what was done in the name of beauty. Dorothy Brennan started checking the name against property records and city directories from the 1880s. Hinrich Vogel showed up in the 1886 Cincinnati directory, listed as a dentist with offices on Vine Street in the heavily German neighborhood north of downtown. The property records showed he had bought a large 3-story brick home that same year, unusual for a recent immigrant still building his practice. In March of 1888, marriage records showed Hinrich Vogel age 34, married Margareta Schiller age 22. The bride's job was listed as factory worker at the Emerson textile mill. No other details appeared in the official records, just names and dates kept in county books. But the photograph suggested something had happened after that marriage. Something that left Margareta Vogel sitting in that chair with her impossible smile. Something that made an unknown writer 15 years later attach that haunting note. Dorothy Brennan asked for more files from the archive storage. What she found in the dusty boxes would reveal a story of obsession, medical power twisted into private horror, and a woman whose husband believed she needed perfection. The investigation into Hinrich and Margareta Vogel had only just begun. The Emerson textile mill employed over 300 workers in 1888, most of them young women from immigrant families. Margareta Schiller worked the day shift, running looms in conditions that were loud, dangerous, and exhausting. Her work record, kept in the Cincinnati Labor Archives, showed remarkable consistency. For 4 years, she missed only 6 days of work. Her supervisors noted her reliability in their quarterly reports. That pattern ended suddenly in March of 1888. Margareta's last day at the mill was March 9th, exactly 1 week before her wedding to Dr. Hinrich Vogel. The payroll book showed she collected her wages that Friday afternoon and never returned. This wasn't unusual for that time. Marriage usually meant the end of factory work for women, especially when marrying professional men. But what happened after the wedding revealed a completely different story. Greta Hoffman lived 3 houses down from the Vogel home on Vine Street. Her diary, given to the Historical Society by her granddaughter, provided a neighbor's view of the newlyweds. The early entries from spring of 1888 were ordinary. She noted seeing Dr. Vogel leaving for his office each morning, always perfectly dressed. She mentioned glimpsing Margareta in the upstairs windows during the first few weeks, arranging curtains and doing household tasks. By late April, the observations changed. "I have not seen Mrs. Vogel outside for nearly 2 weeks, Greta wrote on April 23rd. Dr. Vogel explained to Mixted Bachman at the grocery store that his wife suffers from nervous exhaustion and needs complete rest. He has started ordering all supplies delivered to the house rather than letting her shop. Mr. Bachman finds this strange since the young bride seemed healthy and energetic when they first married." Other neighbors shared similar concerns. Anna Schmidt, who lived directly across the street, mentioned to several people that the Vogel house stayed unusually quiet. No social visits, no afternoon visitors. The curtains on the upper floor windows stayed closed even on bright spring days. Dr. Vogel's professional reputation seemed solid. His dental practice took up the ground floor of a building on West 5th Street where he saw patients 6 days a week. But his published writings revealed an unusual focus. Between 1886 and 1888, he wrote 3 articles for the Journal of Dental Science. The papers discussed theories of facial balance, proportion, and what he called structural perfection through dental modification. The one article from January of 1888, just 2 months before his wedding, outlined his belief that human beauty had been ruined by irregular dental development. He argued that with proper intervention, faces could be reshaped to match classical ideals. He included sketches showing how removing certain teeth and changing jaw structure could alter facial proportions. The journal's editor added a note questioning the practical use of such theories. Hinrich Vogel seemed undeterred by professional skepticism. By June of 1888, Margareta had disappeared completely from public view. Greta Hoffman's diary entries became more worried. "The doctor now answers his own door at all hours. One would expect servants in a house of that size, but I have seen none. Last evening, I saw lamplight in the upper windows well past midnight. What medical work requires such late hours in one's own home?" The isolation grew deeper through that summer. Delivery workers left packages on the porch rather than entering. Dr. Vogel's dental practice continued operating normally, but his home had become something else entirely. Behind those closed curtains, Hinrich Vogel was starting to put his theories about perfection into practice. And Margareta, cut off from her factory work, her friends, and even casual neighborhood contact, had no one to turn to as her husband's obsession took shape. Dr. Hinrich Vogel's private journals were found in 1894, 5 years after his arrest, hidden inside the walls of his Vine Street home during renovation work. The leather-bound books documented an obsession that began long before he met Margareta Schiller. The earliest entries dated to 1883, shortly after Vogel's arrival in America from Bavaria. He described visiting the Cincinnati Art Museum repeatedly, spending hours studying Greek and Roman sculpture. He sketched the proportions of classical faces, measuring the distances between features, calculating ratios he believed represented perfect beauty. The human face as God intended before generations of poor breeding corrupted the ideal, he wrote. But sculpture wasn't his only fixation. Vogel collected porcelain figurines, buying them from importers who specialized in fine German craftswork. He owned over 40 pieces by 1887, displayed throughout his home. Each figurine showed women with smooth, balanced faces and delicate features. He wrote extensively about porcelain's qualities, its permanence, its resistance to decay, its ability to hold shape indefinitely. Living flesh fails. One entry from December 1887 stated, "It sags, wrinkles, yellows with age, but porcelain endures." What if the principles of lasting beauty could be applied to living subjects? What if a skilled practitioner could preserve perfection? When Hinrich met Margareta at a church social in February of 1888, his journals revealed what attracted him. She had, in his view, a face of adequate bone structure requiring only modification to achieve true harmony. He noted her youth, her health, her lack of sophisticated social connections that might interfere with his plans. The courtship lasted 5 weeks. Margareta's own diary, a small book with a simple cloth cover, began as a gift from her sister Anna on her wedding day. The early entries glowed with optimism. Hinrich says, "I will never need to work in the factory again. He promises I will want for nothing. He has such refined taste, such knowledge of beauty and art. I am fortunate to have married a professional man." By late April, her tone shifted slightly. "Hinrich examined my teeth this evening after supper. He says they need attention to achieve proper alignment. He has explained that as his wife, I should represent the highest standards of his profession. The work will improve my appearance considerably. He assures me the procedures will cause minimal discomfort." The first modification happened on May 2, 1888. Vogel's journal described it in technical detail, filing down irregularities, reshaping 2 front teeth to create better symmetry. He gave her a small amount of chloroform, performing the work in their second-floor bedroom, which he had converted into a private treatment space. Margareta cooperated admirably. He wrote, "She understands that beauty requires sacrifice." Margareta's entry from the same day was shorter. "My mouth aches terribly. Hinrich says this is expected and will pass within days. He showed me the changes in his mirror. I suppose they do look more even now." Through May and into June, Vogel performed similar procedures every few weeks. Each time he pushed slightly further. Margareta's diary entries grew shorter and less enthusiastic, though she never directly expressed fear or resistance. "Hinrich knows what is best," she wrote on June 15th. "He studied for many years. I must trust his expertise." But Vogel's journals revealed his growing ambitions. By late June, he was no longer satisfied with minor adjustments. He sketched elaborate plans for more invasive modifications, procedures that went far beyond any legitimate dental practice. He wrote about creating the perfect face, about achieving in living flesh what sculptors could only approximate in marble. "Traditional dentistry is too conservative," he noted on June 28th. "True perfection requires courage. Margareta will be my masterwork, my proof that human beauty can be perfected through scientific intervention. She trusts me completely. She will allow me to complete the work." Summer in Cincinnati grew hot and oppressive. Inside the house on Vine Street, Hinrich Vogel prepared for procedures that would destroy his wife's life in pursuit of an impossible ideal. Autumn arrived in Cincinnati with cooling temperatures and changing leaves. Inside the Vogel house, the changes were far more disturbing. Hinrich's journals from September through November of 1888 documented procedures that crossed every boundary of medical ethics and human decency. He had moved beyond simple dental work into something far more invasive. His entries described giving Margareta chloroform in increasing doses, keeping her sedated for hours while he worked. The bedroom had been fully transformed into a surgical space with tools arranged on covered tables and bright lamps positioned for close examination. "Traditional methods are insufficient for true transformation," he wrote on September 12th. "I have begun the real work." Margareta sleeps peacefully through each session. She wakes confused but trusting. She does not yet understand the scope of what I am achieving. The orders placed through his dental practice told their own story. Supplier records showed Vogel requesting quantities of dental cement, porcelain materials, and specialized tools that far exceeded normal professional needs. One supplier, Hermann Osterman, later testified that he questioned the large orders but accepted Vogel's explanation that he was conducting experimental work for a journal publication. Margareta's diary entries from this period grew increasingly disjointed. Her handwriting, once neat and careful, became shaky and irregular. "I cannot eat properly anymore," she wrote on October 3rd. "Hinrich says this is temporary, that my mouth needs time to adjust to the improvements. Everything tastes strange. I am so tired all the time." By late October, her entries mentioned constant pain and difficulty sleeping. "When I look in the mirror, I barely recognize myself." Hinrich is pleased with his progress. He says I am becoming perfect, but I feel so ill. My jaw aches constantly. I asked to see a doctor, but Hinrich says he is the only doctor I need. Greta Hoffmann's observations from her diary provided the outside perspective. On October 28th, she wrote, I heard the most disturbing sounds from the Vogelhaus last night, like tools scraping against something hard. It continued past midnight. This morning, I saw Dr. Vogel leaving for his office as usual, perfectly composed. But I noticed he had locked every window on the upper floor from the outside. What manner of treatment requires such precautions? Another neighbor, Wilhelm Kruger, mentioned to several people at the German social club that he had encountered Dr. Vogel at a medical supply house buying bottles of chloroform in quantities that seemed excessive. When Kruger inquired, Vogel explained he was treating his wife for severe dental disease that required ongoing intervention. The explanation satisfied Kruger at the time, though he would later regret not investigating further. In November, Margareta's sister Anna made her first attempt to visit. She arrived unannounced on a Tuesday afternoon, hoping to surprise her sister with a visit. Hinrich answered the door and refused to allow her inside. His explanation was smooth and practiced. Margareta was undergoing intensive treatment for a serious dental condition and could not receive visitors. The work was delicate and required complete rest. Anna persisted, asking to at least see her sister through a doorway. Hinrich's manner shifted from polite to cold. He informed Anna that as Margareta's husband, he made all decisions regarding her care and well-being. The law supported his authority. Anna had no legal right to interfere with medical treatment he deemed necessary. She left the porch with growing unease, writing to her parents that evening about Hinrich's strange behavior and refusal to allow even family contact. But in 1888 Ohio, a husband's control over his wife was nearly absolute. Without evidence of immediate danger, authorities would not intervene in domestic matters. Inside the house, Margareta's transformation continued. Hinrich's journal entry from November 15th revealed the true horror of what he had done. The procedures he described went far beyond anything resembling legitimate medical practice. He was systematically destroying his wife's natural dental structure, attempting to replace it with his own artificial constructions. His obsession with porcelain perfection had completely overridden any recognition of Margareta as a human being in agony. She cries sometimes when she wakes, he noted clinically, but she no longer resists. The chloroform helps. In time, she will understand. She will see herself as I see her, perfected, permanent, beautiful beyond what nature could achieve. Winter approached, and Margareta's opportunities for rescue narrowed with each passing week. Winter came to Cincinnati with bitter cold and heavy snow. Anna Schiller's letters to her family grew increasingly desperate. She had attempted 3 more visits to the Vogel house in December, each time turned away by Hinrich with the same polite but firm refusals. Margareta was still undergoing treatment. She required isolation. Visitors would disrupt her recovery. Anna's frustration mounted with each rejection, but she faced an impossible situation. The law offered her no help. A married woman belonged to her husband's authority, and Hinrich Vogel was a respected professional with an unblemished reputation. I know something is terribly wrong, Anna wrote to her parents in late December. Hinrich's explanations feel rehearsed, hollow. He will not allow me even to send letters to Margareta. He claims written correspondence would agitate her nervous condition. But what treatment requires such complete isolation from family? I lie awake at night imagining what might be happening in that house. On January 11, 1889, Anna took a different approach. Rather than calling at the front door, she walked past the house slowly in the early afternoon when she knew Hinrich would be at his office. Most of the windows stayed curtained, but one on the second floor had a gap where the fabric didn't quite meet the frame. What Anna glimpsed in that moment would haunt her for the rest of her life. Margareta stood near the window, or rather leaned against the wall beside it. Even from the street, Anna could see her sister's face had changed dramatically. It looked swollen and distorted, the natural proportions somehow wrong. Her mouth seemed unable to close properly, hanging partially open in a way that suggested something structural had been altered. Margareta moved slowly, almost shuffling, one hand pressed to her jaw. Then their eyes met through the glass. Margareta's expression shifted from blank confusion to desperate recognition. She raised one hand toward the window, her mouth forming words Anna couldn't hear. The gesture was pleading, urgent. But before Anna could react, a shadow appeared behind Margareta. Hinrich had returned home unexpectedly. He pulled Margareta back from the window roughly, his face twisted with anger Anna had never seen before. The curtain snapped shut. Anna stood frozen on the sidewalk, her heart pounding. She had just witnessed something that transformed her suspicions into certainty. Whatever Hinrich was doing to her sister, it was destroying her. Anna's letters from mid-January captured her frantic attempts to find help. She approached the pastor at their church, but he counseled patience and prayer, reminding her that interfering in a marriage was serious business. She spoke with neighbors hoping to build a case for welfare concern, but most were reluctant to act against a respected physician based on speculation. Mr. Hoffmann says his wife Greta has heard disturbing sounds from the house at night. Anna wrote on January 23rd, Mr. Kruger mentioned unusual purchases of medical supplies, but none of them will make formal complaints. They fear being wrong, fear the social consequences of accusing a professional man. Meanwhile, my sister suffers behind those locked windows and I am powerless to reach her. Margareta's diary ended abruptly on February 9, 1889. The final entry consisted of only 3 sentences written in barely readable handwriting. I cannot eat. I cannot speak clearly. God help me. What has he done? No further entries appeared in the small cloth-covered book. Whether Margareta became too ill to write or whether Hinrich discovered and took away the diary remains unclear from the historical record. But that February date marked the point where Margareta's own voice disappeared from the documentation. Everything that followed would be told by others. By Anna's desperate advocacy, by neighbors who finally paid attention, and eventually by the authorities who would be forced to confront the horror hidden on Vine Street. Anna knew she needed someone with legal authority, someone who couldn't be dismissed or intimidated. In late February, she made a decision that would finally break through the wall of respectability protecting Hinrich Vogel. She contacted her brother-in-law, a Cincinnati police officer named Franz Müller, and begged him to investigate what was happening to her sister. The isolation that had protected Hinrich's terrible work for nearly a year was about to end. Franz Müller had been a Cincinnati police officer for 8 years. He had seen violence, desperation, and cruelty in forms that hardened most men to human suffering. But nothing in his experience prepared him for what Anna Schiller described when she came to him in late February of 1889. At first, he was skeptical. Domestic matters fell into murky legal territory, especially when they involved a professional man's treatment of his own wife. Without clear evidence of criminal assault, police rarely intervened in marital affairs. But Anna's account of seeing Margareta at the window, combined with the months of absolute isolation, troubled him enough to make inquiries. Müller began by speaking with the neighbors Anna had mentioned. Greta Hoffman confirmed the strange sounds at night, the locked windows, the complete absence of Margareta from public view. Wilhelm Kruger described the excessive chloroform purchases. The grocer Mr. Bachmann mentioned that Dr. Vogel now ordered all food delivered and refused to allow delivery workers past the front hallway. Each detail alone seemed insignificant. Together they formed a disturbing pattern. On March 7th, Müller decided to make a welfare check. He arrived at the Vogel house at 10:00 in the morning when he knew Hinrich would be at his dental office. The strategy was deliberate. If Hinrich answered, he could refuse entry based on his rights as property owner. But if Margareta was alone and able to come to the door, Müller might assess her condition directly. He knocked firmly and waited. No response came. He knocked again, calling out that he was a police officer conducting a welfare check. The house remained silent. Müller walked around to the side, peering through the gaps in curtains. He saw nothing on the ground floor except furnished rooms standing empty. Then he heard it, a faint sound from the upper floor. Not quite a voice, but something human. A kind of moaning or distressed noise that made his skin crawl. Müller returned to the front door and tested the handle, locked. He made a decision that would later be scrutinized in court. Based on the sound suggesting someone in distress, he forced entry through a side window. The legal justification was thin, but his instinct told him something was terribly wrong. The ground floor revealed nothing unusual. A well-appointed home, clean and orderly, with Hinrich's collection of porcelain figurines arranged on shelves throughout the parlor. But the stairs leading upward were where the trail began. Müller noticed dark stains on the upper steps. His police training recognized them immediately as old bloodstains, cleaned but not completely removed. The second-floor hallway smelled of chemicals, chloroform, carbolic acid, and something else. Something like rot or infection poorly masked by medicinal compounds. 3 doors stood closed. Müller opened the first and found a normal bedroom, unused and dusty. The second revealed Hinrich's study, filled with books, sketches of facial proportions, and anatomical diagrams. The third door was locked from the outside. Müller called out, identifying himself. The moaning sound came again, louder now and clearly from behind that locked door. He forced the lock with his shoulder. The door swung open. The room beyond had been converted into a nightmarish version of a medical facility. A bed stood against one wall, restraints attached to the frame. Tables held instruments and materials that Müller couldn't immediately identify. The air was thick with chemical smells and human suffering. Margareta lay on the bed, conscious but clearly in severe distress. She tried to speak when she saw him, but the sounds that came out were garbled and incomprehensible. Müller moved closer and felt his stomach turn. The damage to her face and mouth was extensive. He could see that her natural dental structure had been systematically destroyed and crudely replaced with artificial materials. Infection was evident in the swelling and discoloration. She was severely malnourished, her cheeks hollow beneath the unnatural swelling of her jaw. Müller left the room immediately and sent for medical assistants and additional officers. Then he went to Dr. Vogel's dental office and placed him under arrest. Hinrich's response, recorded in the police report, was chilling in its detachment. "I was improving her," he said calmly as the handcuffs were applied. "She would have been perfect. You've interrupted my masterwork." The Cincinnati Enquirer broke the story on March 9, 1889, with a headline that sent shockwaves through the city: "Prominent dentist arrested for mayhem against wife." Within days, the case dominated newspapers throughout Ohio and beyond. Margareta was transported to Cincinnati City Hospital, where 3 physicians examined her condition. Their reports, preserved in court records, documented the extent of Hinrich's actions without sensationalizing the medical details. Dr. Robert Ashworth, the senior physician, wrote that the damage was systematic, extensive, and performed without legitimate medical justification. The infection required immediate treatment to prevent further complications. Anna Schiller moved into a room next to her sister's, refusing to leave her side. She wrote to her parents describing Margareta's condition in terms that conveyed both her relief at the rescue and her horror at what had been endured. "She cannot speak properly and may never again," Anna wrote. "But her eyes show recognition and gratitude. She squeezes my hand when I sit beside her. She knows she is finally safe." Hinrich Vogel was held without bail at the Hamilton County Jail. The prosecutor, James Whitfield, knew the case would be difficult despite the obvious physical evidence. Medical authority in marriage was a grey area in 1880s law. Husbands held enormous legal power over their wives' bodies and medical care. Whitfield would need to prove that Hinrich's actions went beyond any reasonable interpretation of spousal medical treatment. The breakthrough came from Hinrich's own journals. Police had seized them during the search of his house, and their contents provided devastating evidence. Whitfield read passages to the grand jury that left the room in stunned silence. Hinrich's clinical descriptions of his procedures, his complete disregard for Margareta's suffering, and his stated goal of creating perfection rather than treating illness demonstrated clear criminal intent. The grand jury indicted Hinrich Vogel on charges of mayhem and aggravated assault in April of 1889. The trial was scheduled for June, giving both sides time to prepare their cases. Hinrich hired Arthur Dennison, a defense attorney known for handling difficult cases involving professional men. Dennison's strategy became clear in pre-trial statements. He would argue that Hinrich acted as a physician treating his wife's dental problems, that his methods may have been unconventional but were not criminal. The prosecution began building their case by interviewing Hinrich's colleagues in the dental profession. Most expressed shock at the journal entries. Dr. William Patterson, who had trained with Hinrich in Germany, provided particularly damning testimony during depositions. He stated that nothing in Hinrich's education or legitimate dental practice would justify the procedures described. "This was not dentistry," Patterson said. "This was obsession manifesting as mutilation." A newspaper coverage intensified as the trial date approached. The case touched on anxieties already present in late 19th century society. The power of professional expertise, the vulnerability of women in marriage, and the question of where medical authority ended and criminal assault began. Editorial writers debated whether Hinrich was a madman or simply an extreme example of husbandly control taken to its logical conclusion. Public sentiment overwhelmingly supported Margareta. Women's groups organized outside the courthouse demanding justice. But legal precedent favored Hinrich's position more than most people realized. Numerous cases existed where husbands had inflicted serious harm on wives under the guise of medical care or discipline, and courts had declined to intervene. Margareta herself presented the most powerful evidence, though she would not take the witness stand in the traditional sense. Her inability to speak clearly prevented verbal testimony, but Whitfield planned to have her present in the courtroom, allowing the jury to see firsthand the results of Hinrich's work. Additionally, she had prepared written statements with Anna's assistance, describing her experience in her own words. The statements, simple and direct, would prove more devastating than any expert testimony. "I trusted him," she wrote. "He was my husband and a doctor. I believed he wanted to help me. By the time I understood what he was truly doing, I was too weak and too frightened to resist. He told me I would be perfect. Instead, he destroyed me." On June 3, 1889, the trial of Hinrich Vogel began. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity, with crowds standing in the hallways hoping to catch glimpses of the proceedings. What would unfold over the next 3 weeks would become one of the most significant criminal trials in Ohio history. The trial opened with prosecutor James Whitfield establishing a simple timeline. He walked the jury through Margareta's life before marriage. A healthy young woman employed steadily with no history of dental problems requiring treatment. Then he documented her disappearance from public life immediately after marrying Hinrich Vogel, the systematic isolation, and finally the discovery of her condition 11 months later. Defense attorney Arthur Dennison countered by emphasizing Hinrich's credentials and professional standing. He presented Hinrich as a dedicated physician who had attempted innovative treatments on a willing patient who happened to be his wife. Unconventional does not mean criminal, Dennison argued. Medical science advances through practitioners willing to explore new methods, but the prosecution's medical witnesses dismantled that defense methodically. Dr. Robert Ashworth took the stand on the second day, describing his examination of Margareta in clinical but devastating detail. He explained that the procedures performed showed no therapeutic purpose. They had not corrected any existing problems but had instead created severe damage where none existed before. "In my 20 years of medical practice," Ashworth testified, "I have never encountered a case where a physician inflicted such harm on a patient. These were not treatments. They were systematic destruction of healthy tissue and bone structure, performed apparently to satisfy the defendant's aesthetic theories rather than any medical necessity." Dr. William Patterson followed, providing context about dental practices and standards. He explained what legitimate dental work entailed and how Hinrich's actions departed completely from accepted methods. Patterson's testimony was particularly effective because he had known Hinrich professionally and could speak to his unusual theories about facial perfection. He believed he could reshape human faces to match classical sculpture, Patterson explained. He discussed these ideas occasionally at professional gatherings. "Most of us dismissed them as philosophical musings. I never imagined he would attempt to implement such theories on a living person, especially his own wife." The most powerful moment came on the fourth day when Margareta's written statements were read to the jury. The courtroom fell absolutely silent as the clerk read her words describing the progression from minor adjustments to increasingly invasive procedures, from trust to confusion to helpless terror. He gave me chloroform so often that I began to lose track of time, one passage stated. I would wake not knowing if hours or days had passed. My mouth hurt constantly. I could not eat properly. When I tried to object, he told me I was too ignorant to understand medical science. He said wives must submit to their husband's superior judgment. By winter, I was too weak to resist even if I had wanted to. I simply endured and prayed for it to end. Margareta sat in the courtroom during this reading, her face partially hidden by a veil. The jury could see enough to understand the physical consequences of Hinrich's actions. Several jurors visibly reacted, one appearing to wipe his eyes. Hinrich's journals provided the final irrefutable evidence. Whitfield read selected passages that revealed Hinrich's mindset with chilling clarity. The entries showed no concern for Margareta's pain or well-being, only frustration when technical difficulties prevented him from achieving his vision of perfection. He had written about her as though she were an object being crafted, not a human being suffering under his hands. The work progresses more slowly than I anticipated. One entry from November stated, living tissue presents challenges that porcelain does not, but I am convinced the final result will justify these difficulties. Margareta will be my proof that human beauty can be perfected through scientific application of aesthetic principles. Denison's defense strategy collapsed under the weight of this evidence. He attempted to argue that Hinrich suffered from a form of medical obsession that diminished his criminal responsibility, essentially pleading insanity without formally doing so. But the prosecution demonstrated that Hinrich had functioned perfectly well in his professional practice throughout the period, treating other patients appropriately while conducting his experiments on Margareta at home. The contrast was damning. Hinrich knew the difference between proper medical care and what he was doing to his wife. He had chosen to do it anyway, protected by the privacy of marriage and the authority society granted to professional men. After 3 weeks of testimony, the case went to the jury on June 24th. They deliberated for 7 hours. When they returned, the verdict was unanimous on both counts. Guilty of mayhem. Guilty of aggravated assault. Hinrich Vogel sat motionless as the verdict was read, showing no emotion. In the gallery, Anna Schiller held her sister's hand and wept. Judge Walter Brenn scheduled sentencing for July 8, 1889. The courtroom was once again filled beyond capacity with many who had followed the trial waiting to hear what punishment Hinrich Vogel would receive. Before pronouncing sentence, Judge Brennan allowed Margareta to submit a final statement. She had written it carefully over several days with Anna's assistance for the physical act of writing. The clerk read it aloud, and its quiet dignity moved even the hardened court observers. I married Hinrich Vogel believing I would build a life with him. Instead, he saw me as material to reshape according to his own vision. He took my health, my ability to speak clearly, my capacity to live a normal life. But he could not take my humanity, though he tried to reduce me to an object of his creation. I ask this court to ensure no other woman suffers as I have suffered. Judge Brennan's sentencing remarks addressed not just Hinrich's crimes but their broader implications. He spoke about the dangerous combination of professional authority and marital power, how Hinrich had exploited both to commit acts that would have been immediately stopped had they occurred in any other context. You held multiple positions of power over your wife, Brennan said, looking directly at Hinrich. As her husband, the law granted you authority over her person and her choices. As a physician, society trusted your judgment about medical necessity. You abused both forms of power in the most outrageous manner possible. You transformed your home into a chamber of suffering and called it medical care. You destroyed a healthy young woman's body and called it perfection. The sentence was 20 years in the Ohio penitentiary. It was among the harshest sentences ever given for crimes committed by a husband against a wife in Ohio at that time. Hinrich showed no reaction as the sentence was pronounced. He was led from the courtroom in shackles, still maintaining the same detached manner he had displayed throughout the trial. Margareta faced a different kind of sentence, a lifetime of consequences from Hinrich's actions. Multiple physicians concluded that the damage was permanent and irreversible. Her jaw structure had been so severely compromised that normal eating would never be possible. Speaking clearly was beyond her capability. The infections had been treated, but the underlying structural destruction could not be repaired with 1880s medical technology. Anna took Margareta into her home on Elm Street, dedicating herself to her sister's care. The arrangement would last for the rest of Margareta's life. Anna never married, choosing instead to provide the stability and safety her sister desperately needed. Letters she wrote to friends over the years revealed the daily challenges. Preparing food Margareta could manage to eat, helping her communicate through written notes and gestures, protecting her from the curious stares of strangers. The case prompted discussions in Ohio medical and legal circles about oversight of physicians' conduct. Several proposals emerged for regulations that would require independent verification of treatments performed on family members, especially wives. But substantive reforms moved slowly. The legal principle of coverture, which essentially made married women the property of their husbands, remained largely intact. Real change would take decades. Hinrich Vogel's dental practice was dissolved, his license permanently revoked. The house on Vine Street stood empty for 2 years before being sold to a family unaware of its history. The new owners discovered Hinrich's collection of porcelain figurines still arranged on the parlor shelves. They were donated to a charity sale, scattered to strangers who never knew what obsession they had once represented. In the Ohio penitentiary, Hinrich maintained his conviction that he had done nothing wrong. Prison records show he wrote letters to medical journals arguing for his theories about facial perfection, though none were published. He complained to prison administrators that they were housing a brilliant innovator alongside common criminals. He expressed no remorse for Margareta's suffering and no recognition that his actions constituted a crime. Guard reports noted his behavior was otherwise unremarkable. He worked in the prison library, kept to himself, and followed rules without incident. But in conversations with other inmates, he would sometimes speak about his interrupted work, about the masterpiece he had been prevented from completing. Even in prison, he remained convinced of his vision's validity. He would die there 8 years later in 1897, still unrepentant. The cause of death was listed as pneumonia, though some records suggest it may have been tuberculosis. Either way, his death passed with little notice outside the prison walls. Margareta Vogel lived 35 years after her rescue from the house on Vine Street. Those decades were marked by quiet resilience rather than recovery, by adaptation rather than healing. She never legally divorced Hinrich. Ohio divorce law in the 1890s made dissolution of marriage difficult even under extreme circumstances, and Margareta lacked the resources for a prolonged legal battle. After Hinrich's death in 1897, she became a widow, a status that somehow felt more acceptable to her than continuing to carry his name while he lived. Anna's letters to family members over the years painted a picture of their life together. They lived modestly but comfortably on Elm Street, Anna working as a seamstress while managing Margareta's care. The routine was carefully structured around Margareta's limitations. Meals required extensive preparation to create food soft enough for her to manage. Communication happened through written notes for complex thoughts, gestures and sounds for simpler needs. She has learned to smile again, Anna wrote in 1902, though her smile still disturbs those who don't know her. Children sometimes stare or ask questions, but she has found ways to express joy, to show affection, to live with dignity despite what was done to her. She tends a small garden now. The flowers don't judge her appearance. Margareta avoided mirrors and reflective surfaces. Anna noted that her sister had not looked at her own face directly since leaving the hospital in 1889. The one photograph taken of her, the image that eventually found its way to the Historical Society archive, was done at Anna's insistence in 1903, 14 years after the trial. Anna believed there should be some visual record of what Hinrich's obsession with perfection had actually created. The photograph showed exactly what the anonymous note described, an unnaturally smooth face with that disturbing, too wide smile. But what the camera couldn't capture was Margareta's humanity, which had survived despite Hinrich's best efforts to reduce her to an object of his aesthetic vision. The Cincinnati community that had followed the trial eventually moved on to other scandals and tragedies. But Margareta's case left traces in unexpected places. Medical schools began using it as a cautionary example of ethical violations. Women's rights advocates cited it in arguments about legal protections needed within marriage. The case appeared in legal textbooks discussing the limits of spousal authority and professional privilege. Margareta herself remained largely hidden from public attention. She attended church services at a small German Lutheran congregation where the members knew her story and treated her with respectful kindness. She participated in charitable work that could be done from home, sewing items for donation. She maintained correspondence with a few close friends who could read her handwriting and didn't require spoken conversation. In 1923, Anna fell seriously ill. The sisters had lived together for 34 years by then, their lives completely intertwined. Anna died that November, leaving Margareta alone for the first time since her rescue. Family members rallied to ensure Margareta's care continued, with a niece moving into the Elm Street house to provide assistance. Margareta Vogel died on February 14, 1924 at age 58. The death certificate listed natural causes, likely heart failure. She was buried beside Anna in Spring Grove Cemetery, their shared headstone bearing only their names and dates with no reference to the horror that had defined Margareta's life. The house on Vine Street where Hinrich had conducted his terrible work stood until 1932, when it was demolished to make way for commercial development. Workers found nothing unusual in the walls except Hinrich's journals, which had been missed during the original police search. These were turned over to the Cincinnati Historical Society, where they joined the growing archive documenting the case. That archive, preserved and catalogued over decades, tells a story that extends far beyond one woman's suffering. It illuminates the dangerous intersection of authority, obsession, and the legal vulnerability of women in marriage. It shows how respectability can conceal horror, how professional credentials can mask cruelty, and how isolation enables abuse to continue unchecked. The photograph of Margareta with her disturbing smile remains in the Historical Society's collection, a silent testimony to the price of one man's pursuit of impossible perfection. Her story serves as a reminder that the darkest human impulses often hide behind the language of improvement, transformation, and love. If this story has disturbed you, if it's made you think about power, control, and the ways suffering can be hidden behind closed doors, then hit that like button. There are hundreds of true stories like Margareta's waiting to be told. Stories that remind us why we must never stop questioning authority, Never stop listening when someone asks for help, and never forget that human dignity matters more than any vision of perfection. The past has lessons for us if we're willing to learn.